So Donald Trump has froze $89 billion in Canadian government and institutional accounts held in American banks. He used the same legal authority that the United States has used to freeze the assets of Iran, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the financial weapon designated for enemy states and terrorist groups, and he just deployed it against America's closest ally. Mark Carney's response came within 6 hours, and it didn't just counter the freeze, it provoked the largest single-day transfer of foreign sovereign assets out of American financial institutions in the history of the global financial system. $2.3 trillion in motion because of one line Carney uttered to every country on the planet. Warren Buffett termed it the greatest self-destructive financial action by an American president since Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. But here's the part that should make everyone in Washington physically nauseous. Trump froze $89 billion that was barely there. Canada has already moved its money surreptitiously during the previous 90 days. The freeze was a gun pointed at an empty vault, and Carney used it to convince the entire world to empty theirs. Let me walk you through what Trump actually accomplished. The executive order was signed Sunday evening and took effect Monday a.m. It invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, the legal legislation that gives the president exceptional power to freeze foreign assets in response to what the executive branch calls a national emergency. This is not a routine trade tool. This is not a tariff. This is the most potent financial weapon in the American armory. The same statute used to freeze Iranian assets after the hostage crisis. The same statute used to lock Russian oligarch fortunes after the invasion of Ukraine. Every single past exercise of this authority targeted nations that the United States regarded hostile opponents, adversaries, rogue states, sponsors of terrorism, and Trump just leveled it at Canada. The order froze 3 kinds of Canadian assets. First, Canadian government accounts held in U.S. banks. Second, Crown Corporation accounts, the financial holdings of Canadian state-owned corporations. Third, Canadian institutional investment accounts, including pension funds and university endowments, total frozen roughly $89 billion. The legal grounds alleged economic urgency created by hostile Canadian trade measures that jeopardize American national security and economic stability. Legal scholars promptly questioned the classification. IEPA demands a true emergency. A trade disagreement with a democratic partner that shares the world's longest undefended border does not reach that standard. The freeze was immediate. No phase-in period. No diplomatic notification of any kind. Canadian financial officials learned what had transpired when Monday morning transactions failed to process. Wire transactions bounced. Account access was forbidden. Canada's finance ministry learnt what was happening from frightened calls from its own banking institutions, not from the White House. No phone call, no diplomatic cable. Canadian institutions wanted to access their own money and discovered a foreign government had barred the door overnight. The intended effect was straightforward. With $89 billion locked in American banks, Canada would be under great pressure to come to the negotiation table on American conditions. The money was leverage. The accounts were hostages. It was the logic of a kidnapper applied to international finance, and it presumed the victim had no contingency plan. They assumed wrong. Because Mark Carney, a man who spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs, understanding exactly how financial systems work, who oversaw the Bank of Canada through a global financial crisis, who ran the Bank of England through Brexit, had been preparing for this scenario for months. 6 hours after the freeze took effect, Carney appeared at a podium in Ottawa. He opened with a statement that sucked the oxygen out of every newsroom on the planet. I want to assure Canadians and the international community that Canada's financial position is secure. The steps taken by the United States this morning affect around $12 billion in Canadian institutional assets, not $89 billion, $12 billion. The room went silent. Carney revealed that Canadian intelligence, working with the Bank of Canada, had rated the risk of an American asset freeze as probable for the previous 4 months. Once the evaluation went from possible to probable, Canada started what the Finance Ministry internally named Operation Sovereign Shield. Over 90 days, Canada progressively removed sovereign and institutional assets from U.S. financial institutions. The transfers were handled gradually in amounts targeted to avoid drawing market attention. Assets were shifted to Canadian domestic banks, to the Bank of England, to the European Central Bank's custody facilities, and to a new Canadian sovereign wealth vehicle based in Switzerland. Every transfer was documented. Every receiving institution was prearranged. The operation was performed with the accuracy of a central banker who understands exactly how money flowed across the global economy. Of the $89 billion the United States believed it was freezing, $77 billion had already been moved. What remained, around $12 billion, was purposefully left in place. Residual amounts in accounts that would have raised warnings if totally cleared. Trump froze $89 billion that wasn't there. He aimed a gun toward a vault that had been surreptitiously emptied over 3 months by a man who knew the gun was coming. That was move 1. Move 2 came within 1 hour. Canada froze all American government and corporate assets held in Canadian financial institutions under the Special Economic Measures Act. Total frozen around $143 billion. This includes U.S. corporate subsidiary operating accounts across every major American corporation doing business in Canada, American pension fund investments in Canadian stocks, U.S. government securities held through Canadian intermediaries, American bank branch operating capital, $143 billion frozen by Canada against $12 billion actually captured by the United States. The hostage taker had just discovered 2 things simultaneously. Their prisoner had already escaped, and the hostage had more hostages of their own, 12 times more. Move 3 was the move that stunned markets. Carney held a second statement, this one geared explicitly to the international community. If the United States of America will freeze the financial assets of its closest ally, a NATO partner, a G7 nation, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, then no nation's assets held in American financial institutions are safe. Not European assets, not Japanese assets, not Korean assets, not Australian assets. Then he delivered the sentence that will be studied in finance textbooks for the next century. Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. That sentence broke the global financial system, not because it was dramatic, because it was true. And every financial minister, every central banker, every sovereign wealth fund management who heard that knew quickly what the sensible answer was. Move your money. Move 4 was total financial separation. Carney announced the immediate activation of the Canadian-European settlement platform for all bilateral transactions with EU nations, bypassing the US dollar entirely. He signed bilateral currency swap agreements with Japan, South Korea, the UK, and Australia. He said that all Canadian sovereign reserves would be held entirely in non-US institutions going forward as permanent policy. 4 moves, 6 hours, vault emptied, counter at 12.1, a sentence that notified the world their money isn't safe. The froze was a pistol. Carney converted it into a nuclear bomb, and then the markets responded, not to the freeze. The freeze was absorbable once Carney disclosed only $12 billion was really seized. The markets responded to the global warning, to your money is a hostage, to the understanding that every foreign government holding assets in American banks had just been given a cause to send their money somewhere else. The Dow began dropping the instant Carney's second comments reached the wires. Bank stocks led the slump. JP Morgan Chase lost 9%. Bank of America lost 12%. Citigroup cratered 14%. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all down between 8% and 15%. The sector-wide fall was the worst single-day performance for U.S. bank equities since the early days of the pandemic. The reason was structural. If foreign governments begin withdrawing sovereign assets from U.S. banks, the banks lose depositors. They lose the inexpensive funding that foreign deposits supply. Norway's National Wealth Fund started an emergency evaluation of its U.S. financial institution exposure within hours. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund initiated precautionary transfers. Singapore's GIC and Temasek published statements regarding reassessing jurisdictional concentration risk. The European Central Bank conducted an emergency session. Total projected assets, initiating transfer or review protocols within 24 hours, $2.3 trillion. Think about that ratio. Trump froze $89 billion in Canadian assets, of which just $12 billion was truly there. Carney's response spurred the movement or review of $2.3 trillion in global assets away from American institutions. That is a ratio of about 200 to 1. The US dollar plummeted 3.2% versus a basket of major currencies, the largest one-day decrease in almost a decade. The reduction wasn't driven by trade data. It was driven by the evaporation of confidence, the dollar's reserve currency status, the privilege that permits the United States to borrow cheaply and project financial power globally depends solely on foreign governments trusting that their dollar holdings are safe from politics. That confidence was broken in a single executive action. Warren Buffett's statement landed with the weight of 7 decades of financial authority. Berkshire Hathaway maintains significant stakes in U.S. bank equities. The disaster was costing his company billions as he spoke. "I've been investing in American financial institutions for 60 years, Buffett stated. Today, for the first time in those 60 years, I'm questioning that decision. Freezing an ally's bank accounts is the financial equivalent of burning your own house down to spite your neighbor, except the house you burn is the one where everyone else puts their valuables. The American financial system is the world's bank. Countries keep their reserves here because they trusted that their money is safe from political risk. That trust took 80 years to create. It was destroyed by a single executive order freezing the accounts of America's closest ally." On Carney's remark, Buffett was exact. Carney didn't need to defeat the freeze defeated itself. All he needed to do was publicize it, point at it, say to the world, "Look what they did to us, you're next." One sentence, 12 words. Your money in American banks is not a deposit, it is a hostage. That sentence will cost the United States more than any tariff, any penalty, any trade war, any military intervention in its history. Buffett disclosed that Berkshire began cutting its U.S. bank stock position 12 months ago, not because we expected this exact order, but because the pattern made it evident the American financial system was being turned from a worldwide service into a political weapon. Political weapons are terrible long-term investments. The rest of the world is reaching the same conclusion today that we did a year ago. The difference is we had 12 months to prepare. They have 12 hours. His closing verdict cut to the foundation. The dollar is worth whatever the world's trust in American institutions is worth. Today, that trust is worth much less than it was yesterday. Trust takes years to create and moments to break. This is the greatest self-destructive financial decision by an American president since Nixon closed the gold window. The worldwide fallout topped anything. 11 sovereign wealth funds formally announced diversification reviews within 48 hours. Combined assets under review, about $4.7 trillion. The European Central Bank accelerated plans for a euro-based alternative to dollar clearing services. China expanded yuan settlement agreements with a dozen additional nations. And Canada, the country that was supposed to be thrown to its knees, Canada's financial system was running smoothly. Canadian banks reported rising deposits as institutions repatriated assets. The Toronto Stock Exchange actually climbed somewhat as international investors thought Canada was the safer location to deposit their money. The weapon hit the wrong target. It was aimed to hurt Canada. Canada's markets went up. America's going down. U.S. bank CEOs were in open mutiny. Jamie Dimon reportedly told a top official, "You just gave every foreign government on earth a reason to take their money out of our banks. Do you have any clue what that affects to our deposit base?" The Federal Reserve convened emergency discussions about liquidity support. American banks were losing foreign deposits in real time. Not a panic-driven run, but a reasoned, methodical, irreversible reallocation by the most sophisticated institutions on earth. So here's where we stand. Trump signed an executive order freezing $89 billion in Canadian accounts, but Canada had already shifted $77 billion, leaving only $12 billion truly blocked. Carney counterfroze $143 billion in American assets, a 12.1 ratio. Then he told the world that their money in American banks is a hostage. That sentence precipitated the migration of $2.3 trillion in global assets away from U.S. institutions. Bank stocks lost $340 billion in market worth. The dollar suffered its greatest fall in a decade. 11 sovereign wealth funds launched withdrawal reviews totaling $4.7 trillion. The EU pushed euro internationalization. China expanded the yuan. The dollar's influence was never about military strength. It was about trust. That trust was the single most valuable asset the United States possessed. It was the invisible basis on which American economic power rested for 8 decades. And it was destroyed in a single executive order signed by a president who thought he was punishing Canada. He wasn't punishing Canada. Canada had already left. He was punishing the dollar. He was penalizing every American bank that depends on foreign money. He was penalizing every American whose retirement savings lie in funds that hold bank stocks. He was punishing 330 million Americans who depend on the stability of a financial system that the rest of the world is now quietly deciding to leave. Trump stopped Canada's bank accounts and thought he was holding a hostage. Carney showed the world the vault was empty, counterfroze 12 times the amount, and said one sentence that will echo through global finance for a generation. Your money in American banks is not a deposit, it is a hostage. That sentence cost the United States more than any tariff, any trade war, any military conflict in its history because it told the truth. And the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken.